Hey everyone, welcome back once again to our CA Foundation Business Economics series where we are discussing business economic concepts in the most quick and practical manner. So, without wasting much time, let's get back to the video. So, today we will be covering chapter 10 Indian Economy, and here is the learning outcome. So, after studying this chapter, you will be able to describe the states of affair of the pre British Indian economy, give an account of the Indian economic phenomena during the British rule, illustrate the turning points in the growth trajectory of India, explain the major reforms initiatives post independence and assess their impact, appreciate the role of Niti Aayog, and portray the current status of the economic sector wise. So here is the first status of Indian economy pre-independence period, that is 1850 to 1947. Pre-independence. Between the 1st and the 17th century AD, India is believed to have the largest economy of the ancient and medieval world. It was prosperous and self-reliant and is believed to have controlled between one third and one fourth of the world's wealth. The economy consisted of self-sufficient villages as well as cities which were centers of commerce, मीन्स जहाँ पे ट्रेड हो रहा है सेंटर, pilgrimage and administration. Compared to villages, cities presented more opportunities for diverse occupations, trades, and gainful economic activities. Simple division of labor intervened with attributes such as race, class, and gender was the basis of the structure of the villages and acted as a built in mechanism of economic and social differentiation. Third, agriculture was the dominant occupation and the main source of livelihood for majority of people. The country has a highly skilled set of artisans and craftsmen who produces, manufactures, handicrafts and textile of superior quality and fineness for the worldwide market. Here is the box one. Ancient economic philosophy of India. The earliest known treatise on ancient economic philosophy is Arthashastra, the pioneering work attributed to Kautilya, Chanakya, that is 321 to 296 BCE. Arthashastra is recognized as one of the most important works on statecraft in the genre of political philosophy. It is believed to be kind of handbook for King Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of Mauryan Empire, containing directives as how to reign over the kingdom and encouraging direct action in addressing political concern without regard of ethical considerations. Artha is not wealth alone, rather, it encompasses all aspects of the material well being of individuals. Arthashastra is the science of artha or material prosperity or the means of substance of humanity, which is primarily wealth and secondarily the land. The major focus of the work is on the means of fruitfully maintaining and using land. Kautilya emphasizes the importance of robust agriculture initiatives for abundant harvest, which will go towards the filling the state's treasury. Taxes which were charged equal for private and state-owned businesses must be fair to all and should be easily understood by the king's subject. Being a multidisciplinary discourse on areas such as politics, economics, military strategy, diplomacy, functions of the state, and the social organization, Kautilya's writing relate to the statecraft, political science, economic policy, and military strategy. True kingship is defined as a ruler's subordination of his own desires and ambition for the good of his people. A king's policy should reflect a concern for the greatest good of the greatest number of his subjects. The preservation and advancement of this good was comprised of seven vital elements, namely the king, ministers, farmlands, fortress, treasurers, military, and the allies. The advent of the European and the British marked a shift in the economic history of India. The period of British rule can be divided into two sub-periods. The rule of East India Company from 1757 to 1858, and second, British government in India from 1858 to 1947. The historic legacy of British colonialism is an important starting point to illustrate the development path of India. With the onset of industrial revolution in the latter half of 18th century, the manufacturing capabilities of Britain increased manifold, and consequently there arose the need to augment raw material supply as well as the need for finding markets for finished goods. This led to a vital reversal of the natures of Indian foreign trade from a export of manufacturers to a exporter of raw materials. The Indian exports of finished goods were subject to heavy tariffs, and the imports were charged lower tariff under the policy of discriminatory tariffs followed by British. This made the export of finished goods relatively costlier. Exports महंगा हो गया and the imports cheaper. In this backdrop, the Indian government lost its competitiveness. Consequently, the external as well as the domestic demand for indigenous products fell sharply, culminating in the destruction of Indian handicrafts and manufacturers. The destruction of Indian manufacturers, mainly due to the hostile imperial policies to serve the British interest and the competition from machine made goods, have reaching adverse consequences on the Indian manufacturing sector. उसका नेगेटिव असर था पूरा इंडियन मैन्युफैक्चरिंग सेक्टर पे. The problem was aggravated by the shift in patterns of demand by domestic consumers favoring foreign goods, as well as many Indians wanted to affiliate themselves with Western culture and way of life. The demand done to the long established production structure had far reaching economic and social consequences, as it destroyed the internal balance of the traditional village economy, which was characterized by the harmonious blending of agriculture and handicrafts. These were manifest as first, large scale unemployment and absence of alternate source of employment, which forced many to depend on agriculture for livelihood. Second, the increased pressure on land caused subdivision and fragmentation of land holdings, subsistence farming reduced agricultural productivity and poverty. Third, the imports of cheap machine made goods from Britain and an overshift of taste and fashion of Indians in favor of imported goods made the survival of domestic industries all the more difficult. Fourth, the system of land tenure, especially the zamindari system, created a class of people whose interests were focused on perpetuating the British rule. Fifth, excessive pressure on land increased the demand for land under tendency, and the zamindars got the opportunity to extract excessive rent and other payments. And sixth, absentee landlordism, high indebtedness of agriculturists, growth of a class of exploitative moneylenders, and low attention to productivity enhancing measures led to a viral collapse of Indian agriculture. We shall now have a look into the stagnated nature of industrialization during the colonial era. Factory based production did not exist in India before 1850. The modern industrial enterprise in colonial area India started to grow in the mid 19th century. The cotton milling business grew steadily throughout the second half of the 19th century and achieved high international competitiveness. The cotton mill industry in India has 9 million spindles in the 1930s, which placed India in the fifth position globally in terms of number of spindles. Jute mills also expanded rapidly in and around Calcutta. in response to a mounting global demand for ropes and other products, and Indian jute occupied a large share of the international market by the 19th century. At the end of 19th century, the Indian jute mill industry was the largest in the world in terms of amount of raw jute consumed in production. In addition, brewing, paper milling, leather making machines, and rice milling industries also developed during the century. Heavy industries such as iron industry were also established as early as 1814 by British capital. India's iron industry was ranked 8th in the world in terms of output in 1930. सूत्र अपन टॉप 10 में थे. Due to progress in modern industrial enterprises, some industries even reached global standards by the beginning of 20th century. Just before the Great Depression, India was ranked as the 12th largest industrialized country measured by the value of manufactured products. The producer goods industries, however, did not show high level of expansion. Perhaps the most important of the factor that led to this state of affairs was the pressure exerted by the English producers in matter of policy formulation to positively discourage the development of industries which were likely to compete with those of the English producers. मतलब जो इंडस्ट्रीज का सीधा कंपटीशन ब्रिटिश गुड्स के साथ होने वाला है उसके फेवर में की जगह पे उसके अगेंस्ट में कुछ पॉलिसी डिज़ाइन करेंगे, कुछ भी टैक्सेशन हाई या कुछ ऐसी चीज़ जिसके कारण जो इंडस्ट्री सेट होने वाली थी वो सेट नहीं होगी या फिर उस पर नेगेटिव इम्पैक्ट आएगा. India's industrial growth was insufficient to bring in a general transformation in its economic structure. The share in the net domestic product (NDP) of the manufacturing sector, excluding small scale and cottage industries, was barely reached 7% even in 1946. Considering its low progress, the share of factory employment in India was also small, that is 0.4% of the total population in 1900 and 1.4% in 1941. मतलब ज़्यादा एम्प्लॉयमेंट फैक्ट्री डिपेंडेंट नहीं थी. Then we have Indian economy post independence 1947 to 1991. At the time of independence, India was overwhelming rural inhabited by most illiterate people who were exceeding poor. We had a deeply stratified society characterized by extremely heterogeneity on many counts. With the literacy rate just above 18%, hardly 18% literate थे, barely 32 years of life expectancy in 1951, India's poverty was not just in terms of income alone, but also in terms of human capital. For historic reason, the Nehruvian model, which supported social and economic redistribution and industrialization directed by the state, came to dominate the post-independence Indian economic policy. Centralized economic planning and direction was at its core of India's development strategy, and the economic policy were crafted to accomplish rapid economic growth accompanied by equity and distributive justice. The Planning Commission of India was established to meticulously plan for the economic development of the nation in line with the socialist strategy. This was carried out through the 5 year plan which were developed, implemented and monitored by the Planning Commission. It is pertinent here to have a look at the ideology of industrialization prevailed in the early days of independence. India's political leadership was keen on establishing an economic system in which the central government would have authority to design the economic strategy and to carry out the necessary investment in coordination with the private sector. Rapid industrialization of the economy was at the cornerstone of Nehru's development strategy. The concept of planned modernization meant a systematic planning to support industrialization. The bureaucrats and the technocrats envisioned a substantially significant role for the state in industrialization. The Industry Policy Resolution 1948 encouraged an expanded role of the public sector and licensing to the private sector. It granted state monopoly for strategic areas such as atomic energy, arms and ammunition, and railway. Also, the right to new investment in basic industries were exclusively given to the states. मतलब स्टेट डिसाइड करेंगे कि क्या इन्वेस्ट कर सकते हैं, कहाँ इन्वेस्ट कर सकते हैं. The policy in 1950s were guided by two economic philosophies. First, then the Prime Minister Nehru's visualization to build a socialist society with emphasis on heavy industry, and the Gandhian philosophy of small scale and cottage industry and village republics. The Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956 through provided a comprehensive framework for industrial development was loop-sided as its guiding principle supported enormous expansion of the scope of the private sector. A natural outcome of the undue priority of public sector was the dampening of private initiative and enterprise. For obvious reason, private investment were discouraged, and this had a long-lasting negative consequences for industrial growth. India followed an open foreign investment policy and relatively open trade policy until the late 1950s. A balance of payment crisis emerged in 1958, causing concerns regarding foreign exchange depletions. Consequently, there emerged a gradually tightening of trade and reduction in investment licensing of new investments requiring import of capital goods. The comprehensive import controls were maintained until 1966. In the first 3 decades after independence, that is 1950 to 1980, India's average annual rate of growth of GDP, often referred to as Hindu growth rate, was a modest 3.5%. Mark this super. While agriculture was not neglected, the thrust of the first decade and half was the capital goods, capital intensive projects such as dams, power plants, and heavy industrialization rather than consumer goods. The major shift in the Indian economic strategy was in the mid 1960s. Agriculture was not given adequate priority in the second plan and the outlays were reduced. The strategy for agriculture development till then was a reliance on institutional model, that is land reforms, farm cooperatives, etc. And not much more importance was given to technocratic areas such as research and development, irrigations, etc. These institutional reforms were only modest successful and the productivity increase in agriculture was meagre. With continuous failure of monsoon, two several and consecutive droughts struck India in 1966 and 67. The agriculture sector recorded substantial negative growth and India faced a serious food problem. India has to depend on the US for food aid under PL 480. A quantum jump in the food grain production was a need of the hour. Increasing productivity in agriculture was given the highest priority. This, in fact, started a strategic change in government's agriculture policy. The new wave of change relied less on the earlier efforts at institutional change and relied more on enhancing productivity of agriculture. Since food prices हो रहे थे तो ज़्यादा फोकस दिया है एग्रीकल्चर के ऊपर, पॉलिसीज उसके अकॉर्डिंगली चेंज हुई, स्पेशली ऑफ व्हीट. A thorough restructuring of agriculture policy referred to as Green Revolution, Harit Kranti, Green Revolution was initiated. The Green Revolution was materialized by innovative farm technologies, including high yield seed varieties and intensive use of water, fertilizer, and pesticides. The Green Revolution was successful in increasing agriculture productivity through technical progress and significant increased food grain production, enabling India to tide over the food problem. While India drastically changed its agriculture policies, the government introduced extra stringent administrative controls on both trade and industrial licensing and launched a wave of nationalization. The government nationalizes 14 banks in 1969 and then followed it up with nationalizing another 6 in 1980s. The wide sweep of the interventionist policies that have come to exist in the 1960s have irreversible consequences in the next decade. The economic performance during the period of 1965 to 1981 is the worst in independent India's history. The decline in growth during this period is attributed mainly to decline in productivity. The license Raj, the authoritative policies that dominated in 1960s and 1970s, the external shock such as three wars, first in 1962, 1965 and 1971, major droughts, especially 1966 and 67, and the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 continued to be to the decelerated growth that lasted 2 decades. India, being practically a closed economy, missed out on the opportunity created by a rapidly growing world economy. Many government policies aimed at equitable distribution of income and wealth effectively killed the incentive for creating wealth. Equity driven policies were also large anti growth. The Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices MRTP Act 1969 was aimed at regulation of large firms which have relatively large market power. Several restrictions were placed on them in terms of licensing, capacity additions, mergers and acquisitions. Thus, policies restrictions, the possibility of expansion of these businesses houses kept their entry away for nearly all but a few highly capital incentive sectors. In 1969, the policy of reservation of many products for exclusive manufacture by the small scale sector was initiated with the objective of promotion of small scale industries. It was argued that this policy will encourage labor intensive economic growth and allow redistribution of income by shifting income towards lower wage earners. However, this policy excluded all big firms from labor intensive industries, and India was not able to compete in the world market for these products. Stringent labor laws which were in place also discouraged starting of labor intensive industries in the organized sector. There was a growing realization among policymakers and industrialists that the prevailing strict regime is invariably counterproductive, and the most of the controls and regulations had not delivered in the absence of adequate incentives and openness, which was necessary condition for sustained rapid growth. Then comes part 3, 10.3, the era of reforms. The seeds of early liberalization and reforms were sown during the 1980s, especially after 1985. In India, 1980s, in early 1980s, considerable efforts were initiated in different directions to restore reasonable price stability through a combination of tight monetary policy, fiscal modernization, and a few structural reforms. These initiatives, spanning 1981 to 1989, practically referred as early regularization, were specially aimed at changing the prevailing thrust on inward oriented trade and investment practice. In fact, this liberalization is often referred to as reforms by stealth to denote its ad hoc and not widely publicized nature, despite the fact that the efforts were not in the form of comprehensive package as the one in 1991 to reverse the centralized controls and protectionist bias in policies. They started bearing fruits in the form of higher growth rate during 1980s as compared to previous 3 decades. The average annual growth rate of GDP during the sixth plan period, that is 1980 to 85, and the seventh plan period, that is 1985 to 1990, were 5.7 and 5.8% respectively. The early reforms of 1980s broadly covered three areas, namely industry, trade, and taxation. Simultaneously, the government also embarked on the policy of skillful exchange rate management. The prominent industrial policy initiatives during a period directed towards removing constraints on growth and creating a more dynamic industrial environment were: in 1985, delicensing of 25 broad categories of industries were done. This was later extended to many others. Then, the facility of broadbanding was accorded for industry groups to allow flexibility and rapid change in their product mix without going in for fresh licensing. In other words, the firms in the engineering industry were allowed to change their product mix within their existing capacity. For example, firms may switch production different between different production lines such as trucks, cars without a new license. मतलब इसके पहले अगर आपको प्रोडक्शन लाइन शिफ्ट करना है तो आपको सेपरेट लाइसेंस ही लेना पड़ेगा या इन्फॉर्म करना पड़ेगा, पर उन्होंने कुछ अमेंडमेंट या अपडेट किए या रिलैक्सेशन दिए, उसके कारण आप इन प्रोडक्शन लाइन स्विच कर सकते हो, प्रोडक्ट्स चेंज कर सकते हो, तो थोड़ा फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी मिली प्रोडक्शन के लिए. Then, to relax the hold of the licensing and capacity constraints on larger MRTP firms, in 1985-86, the asset limit above which firms were subject to MRTP regulations were raised from 20 crores to 100 crores. MRTP एक्ट के कुछ लिमिट रखा था कि जिनका टर्नओवर है, जिनकी टोटल एसेट्स 20 CR तक है, उनके ऊपर ही एप्लीकेबल होगा. बाद में वो लिमिट को 20 से 100 CR किया. The multi-point excise duties were converted into a modified value added, that is mod VAT, just like GST tax, which significantly reduced the taxation on inputs and associated distortions. Establishment of Securities and Exchange Board of India (SEBI) as a non-statutory body on April 12, 1988 through a resolution of Government of India. The Open General License (OGL) list was steadily expanded. The number of capital goods items included in the OGL list expanded, steadily reaching 1329 in April 1990. और list और products add हुए उसमें. Several export incentives were introduced and expanded. The exchange rate was set at a realistic level, which helped expand exports and in turn reduce pressure on foreign exchange needs for import. Price and distribution control on cement and aluminium were entirely abolished. Based on the real effective exchange rate REER, the rupee was depreciated by about 30% from 85-86 to 89-90. This reflects a considerable change in the official attitude towards exchange rate depreciation. The budget for 1986 introduced policies for cutting taxes further, liberalizing imports and reducing tariffs. However, the growth performance of the economy was thwarted due to structural inadequacies and distortions. The private sector investments were inhibited due to reasons such as convoluted licensing policy, public sector reservations, and excessive government control. Due to reservation of goods to small scale sector as well as excessive price and distribution control, the private sector was virtually discouraged for making investment. The public sector, which led the manufacturing and service sector, was plagued by inefficiencies, government control, and bureaucratic procedures. Despite the fact that they were massive in size and enjoyed monopoly in their respective areas, their performance was far from satisfactory and yielded returns were very low returns on investment. Yielded मतलब जो returns आए उसके ऊपर yields आए. The MRTP Act has many restrictive conditions, creating barriers for entry, diversification, and expansion for large industrial houses. Import controls in the form of tariffs, quotas, and quantitative restrictions ensured that foreign manufacturers and components did not cross the borders and compete with the domestic industries. Foreign investments and foreign competition were not allowed on grounds of affording protection to domestic industries. Briefly put, the rules and regulations which were aimed at promoting and regulating the economic activities became a major hindrance to growth and development. Though the reform in 1980s were limited in scope and were without a clearer observable roadmap as compared to new economic policy in 1990s, they were instrumental in bringing confidence in the mind of politicians and policymakers regarding the efficacy of the policy changes to produce sustainable economic growth. They believe that well-regulated competitive market can ensure economic growth and also increase total welfare got fostered in the minds of policymakers. In other words, the idea that government intervention in market did not always be accepted and the standard and that market should be given priority over government in the conduct of good number of economic activities gained a broad acceptance. Thus, the liberalization in the 1980s served as the necessary foundation for more universal and organized reforms in 1990s. The economic reforms of 1991. India embarked on the bold set of economic reforms in 1991 under Narasimha Rao government. The causes attributed to the immediate need for such drastic change are: first, the fiscal incentives for enhanced economic growth in 1980 saw the government revenue expenditure consistently exceeding its revenue receipts. मतलब खर्चा ज़्यादा है, इनकम कम है. Expense is more than income in a rising way. The fiscal deficit was financed by huge amount of domestic as well as external debt. डेफिसिट को कवर करने के लिए डेब्ट्स ले रहे, डेट्स यानी लोन ले रहे हैं. The high level current expenditure proved clearly unsustainable and got manifested on extreme large fiscal deficits and adverse balance of payments. Second, persistent huge deficit led to swelling public debt and a large proportion of government revenues had to be embarked for interest payment. बहुत सारा जो रेवेन्यू का पार्ट है वो इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट में ही जा रहा है. जो डेट लिया है, लोन लिया है, उसका इंटरेस्ट भी पेमेंट करना पड़ता है. The surge in oil prices triggered by the Gulf War in 1990 and the consequences served strain on the balance of payment. The foreign exchange reserves touched the lowest point with the reserve of only $1.2 billion, which was barely sufficient for 2 weeks of import. This was a major context that triggered economic reforms. Fifth, tightening of import restrictions to muster forex of essential imports resulted in reduction in industrial output. 6. India has to depend on external borrowings from the International Monetary Fund (IMF). Which in turn put forth stringent conditions in terms of corrective policy measures before additional drawings could be made. And 7th, the fragile political situations along with the crisis in the economic front ballooned into what may be called crisis of confidence. The year 1991 marked a paradigmic shift in the Indian policy reforms. The nation, which has embraced the socialist model with the state playing an overriding role in the economy, had the history of the government persistent intervening in the market. Collapse of the Soviet Union and the spectacular success of China based on an outward oriented policies were lessons for the Indian policymakers. The reform instituted in 1991 aimed to move the economy towards greater market orientation and external openness. The reforms, popularly known as LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization, LPG, mark this, LPG, split a major shift in economic philosophy and fundamental change in approach and had two major objectives. First, reorientation of the economy from a centrally directed and highly controlled one to a market friendly or market oriented economy. And second, macroeconomic stabilization by substantial reduction in fiscal deficit. A detailed description of reform measures is beyond the scope of this unit. We shall now have a brief account of the major measures taken in 1991. As we know, the momentum for reforms oriented in the critical economic, fiscal and balance of payment crisis. Therefore, the reform package was structured as a core package of mutually supportive reforms to address the balance of payment crisis and structural rigidities. The policy paradigm is focused on shifting from central direction to market orientation. The policies can be broadly classified as first, stabilization measures, which were short term measures to address the problem of inflation and adverse balance of payment, and second, the structural reform measures, which are long term and of continuing nature, aimed at bringing in productivity and competitiveness by removing the structural rigidities in different sectors of the economy. Then we have 10.4.1, the fiscal reforms. The escalating deficit levels rendered the stabilization efforts rather than complicated. Bringing in fiscal discipline by reducing the fiscal deficit was vital because the crisis was caused by excessive domestic demand, surge in imports, and widening of the current account deficit (CAD), which was to be financed by drawing down on reserves. This was attempted by radical measures to augment revenues and curtail government expenditure. गवर्नमेंट के खर्चे कम किए. Measures to this effect included introduction of a stable and transparent tax structure, ensuring better tax compliance, thrust on curbing government expenditure, reduction in subsidies and abolition of unnecessary subsidies, disinvestment of part of government's equity holdings in select public sector undertaking, encouraging private sector participation. In order to bring in fiscal discipline, it was essential to do away with the temptation of finance deficit through the easy path of money creation. Therefore, the government entered into a historic agreement with the Reserve Bank in September 1994 to bring down the fiscal deficit in the phased manner to nil by 1997-98. Monetary and financial sector reforms. Drastic monetary and financial sector reforms were introduced with the objective of making the financial system more efficient and transparent. The focus was mostly on reducing the burden of non-performing assets on government banks, introducing and sustaining competition, and deregulating interest rate. This includes many measures. Important among them are: first, interest rate liberalization and reduction in control on banks by the RBI in respect of interest rate chargeable on loans and payable on deposits. Second, opening of new private sector banks and facilitating greater competition among public sector, private sector and foreign banks, and simultaneously removal of administrative constraint that reduced efficiency. Third, reduction in reserve requirement, namely statutory liquidity ratio (SLR) and cash reserve ratio (CRR), in line with the recommendation of the Narasimhan Committee report in 1991. Fourth, liberalization of banks branch licensing policy and granting of freedom to banks in respect of opening, relocation and closure of banks. Fifth one, prudential norms of accounting in respect of classification of assets, disclosure of income and provision of bad debts were introduced in tune with the Narasimhan Committee recommendation to ensure that the books of commercial bank reflect the accurate and truthful picture of their financial position. Then we have reforms in capital market. The SEBI, Securities and Exchange Board of India, which was set up in 1988, was given the statutory recognition in 1992. SEBI has been mandated as an independent regulator of the capital market so as to create a transparent environment which would facilitate mobilization of adequate resource and their efficient allocation. Then we have the new industrial policy. The new industrial policy announced by the government on 24th July 1991 sought to substantially deregulate industry so as to promote growth of a more efficient and competitive industrial economy. In order to provide greater competitive stimulus to the domestic industry, a series of reforms were introduced. So we have a series of reforms. First, the new economic policy put an end to the license Raj by removing licensing restrictions on all industries except for 18 that related to security and strategic concern, social reason, problems related to safety, and overriding environmental issues. Consequently, 80% of the industries were taken out of the licensing framework. This is subsequently reduced to five, namely arms and ammunition, atomic substance, narcotic drugs, and hazardous chemicals. Narcotic drugs and hazardous chemicals, distillation and brewing of alcoholic drinks, and cigarettes and cigar, as they have several implications on health, safety, and environment. Second, public sector was limited to eight sector based on security and strategic grounds. Subsequently, only two items remained: railway transport and atomic energy. The Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practice (MRTP) Act was restructured, and the provisions related to mergers and amalgamation and takeover were repealed. This has eliminated the need for pre-entry scrutiny of investment decisions and prior approval for large companies of for capacity expansion or diversification. मीन्स नए कंपनीज को थोड़ा इजियर कर दिया नया किसी को इन्वेस्ट करना है. दिस इज फॉर 1991. Many good produced by small scale industries have been de-reserved, enabling entry of large scale industries. The policy ended the public sector monopoly in many sectors. The number of areas reserved for public sector was narrowed down to ensure liberal participation by the private sector. Only 8 industries which were of importance due to strategic and security concerns were reserved for the public sector. The change continued, and we find that now the industry reserved for the public sector are only a part of atomic energy generation and some core activities in railway transportation. Sixth, foreign investment was also liberalized. The concept of atomic approval was introduced for foreign direct investments (FDI) up to 51%, which was later extended to nearly all industries except the reserved one. FDI is prohibited only in four sectors, that is retail, trade, atomic energy, lottery business, and betting and gambling. External trade was further liberalized by substituting the positive list approach of listing licensing free items on the OGL list with the negative list approach. The policy did away with import licensing on all but a handful of intermediate and capital goods. The consumer goods which remained under licensing was made free 10 years later. Today, except for a handful of goods disallowed on health, environmental, and safety grounds, and few others such as edible oil, fertilizer, and petroleum products, all goods can be imported. In 1990-91, the highest tariff rate was 355%. The top tariff rate was brought down to 85% in 93-94 and 50% in 95-96, and by 2007-8 it came down to 10% with some exceptions such as automobile at 100%. Rupee was devalued by 18% against the dollar. From 1994 onwards, all current account transactions including businesses, education, medical and foreign travel were permitted at market exchange rates, and rupee became officially convertible on current account. And 10th, the disinvestment of government holdings of equity share capital of public sector enterprise was a very bold step. The hereto constrained public sector units were provided with greater autonomy in decision making and opportunity for professional managements for ensuring reasonable returns. The budgetary support to public sector was progressively reduced. Then we have trade policy reforms. The trade policy reforms aimed at dismantling of quantitative restrictions on imports and exports, focusing on a more outward oriented regime with phase reduction and simplification of tariff and removal of licensing procedures for import. A number of export incentives were continued and new ones were initiated for boosting exports. Export duties were removed to increase the competitive position of Indian goods in international market. In 1991, India still have a fixed exchange rate system under which the rupee was pegged to the value of a basket of currencies of major trading partners. In July 1991, the Indian government devalued the rupee by between 18 to 19%. In March 1992, the government decided to establish a dual exchange rate regime. The government allowed importers to pay for some imports with foreign exchange valued at free market rates, and other import could be purchased with foreign exchange purchased at the government mandated rate. In 1993, the government unified the exchange rate and allowed for the first time the rupee to float, means a floating rate. From 1993 onwards, India has followed a managed floating rate in exchange rate system. अब इसके पहले ये जो बता रहे थे यहाँ पे कि कुछ पार्ट पे आप फिक्स एक्सचेंज रेट है उसके हिसाब से पे करेंगे और कुछ जगह पे फ्लोटिंग रेट के हिसाब से. उसके बाद यूनिफाइड होके 1993 के ऑनवर्ड्स एक ही यूनिवर्सल यूनिफाइड रेट हम यूज़ करते हैं. अभी एक्सचेंज रेट है वो फ्लोटिंग वाला है, यानी चेंज होता है. India has witnessed vast change over the last 31 years of economic reforms. Changes enumerated below are only broad observations and are in no way comprehensive. India has increasingly integrated its economy with the global economy. India has progressively moved towards a market-oriented economy with a sizable reduction in government's market intervention and control. There is an unprecedented growth of private sector investment initiatives. A number of sectors such as auto components, telecommunications, software, pharmaceuticals, biotechnologies, and professional service have achieved very high level of international competitiveness. Easing of trade controls has enabled easier access for foreign technologies, inputs, know-how, and finance. Stable foreign direct investment inflows and substantial foreign portfolio investments. India enjoys a solid cushion of foreign exchange reserves, close to 8 months of import cover. India has one of the largest holding of international reserves in the world. Robust demand for information technology and financial service had kept the service trade surplus high at around 3.7% of GDP. Pressure on the Indian rupee is lowered compared to emerging market economies (EMAs). Increased income, large domestic market, and high level of aggregate demand sustained the economy. India is better placed than most of the emerging market economies to deal with global headwinds. Poverty has reduced substantially. Reforms led to increased competitiveness in sectors like banking, insurance, and other financial services, leading to greater customer choice and increased efficiency. It has also led to increased investment and growth of private players in these sectors. Infrastructure sector has achieved phenomenal growth. Value-added share of agriculture and allied activities has declined steadily over the past 4 decades. India's financial sector has also deepened considerably due to increased financial sector liberalization. However, the country is constrained by high level of fiscal deficit, inflation, and high level of debt as a share of GDP at 86% of GDP in financial year 2021-22. Among the emerging market and developing economies (EMDs), India's debt is higher than its average of 64.5% for 2022 as per IMF report. Now we have GDP growth rates post 1991 reforms. As we are aware, GDP growth rate is regarded as the most reliable indicator of economic growth. The following table and graphical presentation present data on GDP growth rate post 1991 reforms. तो यहाँ पे आप देखेंगे ईयर वाइज ग्रोथ रेट कैसे हुआ. 1% से 5, 4 बढ़ते गया. सिर्फ कोविड जब भी हुआ तब एक नेगेटिव ग्रोथ रेट था. क्या आप देख रहे ओवरऑल पॉजिटिव में सिर्फ इधर बीच में थोड़ा सा कम हुआ है. और 2021 के पे 8.68122% में रहा. ये है उसका ग्राफ. ये कोविड वाला पीरियड है 2022. इसको छोड़ दिया तो आप देखेंगे कि ये रेंज में आ रहा है 4 to 8% में. ठीक है. Then we have Niti Aayog, a bold step for transforming India. For nearly 64 years, the Planning Commission of India, a powerful advocate of public investment-led development, was one of the most important institutions within India's central government. The new ideologies for the neoliberal era, with the center of attention on market orientation and shrinking roles of the government and the collapse of planning system, called for a change in the nature, composition, and scope of institution of governments. On 1st Jan 2015, the apex policy-making body, namely Policy Commission, was replaced by the National Institute for Transforming India, Niti Aayog. The major objectives of such a move was to spur innovative thinking, by objective expert and promote cooperative federalism by enhancing the voice and influence of the states. Niti Aayog is expected to serve as a think tank of the government and a direction and policy dynamo. Niti Aayog will work towards the following objectives. First, to evolve shared vision of national development priorities, sectors, and strategies with the active involvement of states. Second, to foster cooperative federalism through structural support initiatives and mechanisms with the state on a continuous basis, recognizing the strong states make a strong nation. Third, to develop mechanisms to formulate credible plans at the village level and aggregate this progressive at higher level of governments. Fourth, to ensure on all areas that are specifically referred to it that are that the interests of national security are incorporated in economic strategy and policy. Fifth, to pay special attention to the section of our society that may be at risk of not benefiting adequately from economic progress. And sixth, to design strategic and long-term policy and programs, framework and initiatives and monitor their progress and their efficacy. Seventh, to provide advice and encourage partnerships between key stakeholders and national and international like-minded think tanks as well as educational and policy research institutions. 8. To create a knowledge, innovation, and entrepreneurial support system through a collaborative community of national and international experts, practitioners, and other partners. 9. To offer a platform for the resolution of intersectoral and interdepartmental issues in order to accelerate the implementation of the development agenda. 10. To maintain a state of art resource center, be a repository of research on good governance and best practices in sustainable and equitable development, as well as the help of their dissemination to stakeholders. 11. To actively monitor and evaluate the implementation of programs and initiatives, including the identification of the needed resources, so as to strengthen the probability of success and scope of delivery. 12. To focus on technology upgradation and capacity building for implementation of programs and initiatives. And 13. To undertake other activities as may be necessary in order to further execution of the national development agenda and the objectives mentioned above. Niti Aayog. These are the website where you can refer. The key initiatives of Niti Aayog are LIFE, which envisions replacing the prevalent use and disposal economy. Second, the National Data and Analytics Platform NDAP, facilitating and improving access of national government data. You can visit this also. Third, Shunya campaign aims to improve air quality in India by accelerating the development of EVs. Fourth, eAmrit is the one-stop destination for all information on EVs. Fifth, India Inside Policies IPI. Sixth, Methanol Economy. A program is aimed at reducing India's import bill, greenhouse gases emissions, and converting coal reserves and municipal solid waste into methanol. And seventh, transforming India's gold market, constituted by Niti Aayog to recommend measures for tapping into the potential of the sector and provide a stimulus to export and economic growth. There are arguments put forth by experts about the weakness of the system. They argue that Niti has a limited role and it does not produce national plans, control expenditures, or review state plans. The major shortcoming of Niti is its exclusion from the budgeting process. It also lacks autonomy and balance of power within the policy making apparatus of the central government. The termination of Planning Commission had strengthened the hands of the Ministry of Finance with its fixation of near-term macroeconomic stability and the natural instinct to limit expenditure. But Niti lacks the independence and power to perform as a counterweight, to act as a voice of development concerned with inequalities. कुछ negative बातें भी है. Then we have 10.7, the current state of the Indian economy, a brief overview. On account of the enormity of the economic phenomena and the dynamic nature of economic variables, it is not possible to have updated and comprehensive documentation on the current state of the economy. Given the constraint of this unit, an attempt is made in the following sections to present the broad nature of the present day Indian economy based on the three sectors, namely primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary sector, agriculture, with its allied sector, is indisputably the largest source of livelihood in India. Till the end of 1960s, India was a food deficient nation and depends on import. India has emerged as the world's largest producer of milk, pulses, jute, and spices. India has the largest area planted under wheat, rice, and cotton. It is the second largest producer of fruits, vegetables, tea, farmed fish, cotton, sugarcane, wheat, rice, cotton, and sugar. India's food and grocery market is the world's sixth largest, with retail contributing 70% of the sales. India is the world's largest cattle herd, that is buffaloes. The Indian livelihood stock sector attended a record growth of 6.6% during the last decade, that is from 2010 to 2019, emerged as the major producer of milk, egg, and meat in the world. India grows a large variety of cash crops, of which cotton, jute, and sugarcane are prominent. Although the share of agriculture has been declining in overall gross product of India, it continues to grow in absolute terms. According to the latest estimate, 47% of the Indian population is directly dependent on agriculture for living. It also contributes a significant figure to the GDP. Gross value added by the agriculture and allied sector was 18.8% in 2021-22 until 31st Jan 2022. The index number of agriculture production in 2021-22 based tennium ending 2007-8 was 100 for categories namely all crops, food grains, cereals, wheat, and coarse cereals were above 140, and the rice pulses were 138.7 and 196.2 respectively. For non-food grains, it was 142.9. These figures show sustained increase in agriculture output. Food grains production has reached 315.7 million tons in 2021-22. Private investment in agriculture has increased to 9.3% in 2021. This is the data is from the Handbook of Statistics on the Indian Economy 2022. You can refer latest one that was published before budget date. Handbook is published every year before budget date, that is 31st Jan. You can refer that. 31st Jan every year. As per the Economic Survey 2022-23, agriculture remained robust, recording a growth of 3.5% in 22-23, driven by buoyant rabi sowing and allied activities. The performance of the agriculture and allied sector has been buoyant over the past several years, most of which is on account of the measures taken by government to augment crop and livestock productivity, ensure certainty of returns to the farmers through price support, that is minimum support price of all 23 mandated crops is fixed at 1.5 times of all India weighted average cost of production. Promote crop diversification, improve market infrastructures through the impetus provided for the setting up of farmer producer organizations and promotion of investment in infrastructure facilities through the Agriculture Infrastructure Fund AIF. India has achieved a remarkable shift from a food deficient and import dependent nation during the early 1960s to a food exporting nations. India is among the top 10 exporters of agriculture products in the world. Export of agriculture and allied products has witnessed significant increase during the last few years and touched an all-time peak of 3,74,611 crores during the last 1 year. Exports of agriculture and processed food products rose by 25% within 6 months of the current financial year, that is 22-23, April September, in comparison to the corresponding period in 2021-22. APEDA, Agriculture and Processed Food Export Development Authority, is entrusted with the responsibility of export promotion of agricultural products. तो अपीडे का एम है कि उन्हें एक्सपोर्ट प्रमोशन के लिए वो एक्ट करती है. A number of liberalization measures are adopted by the government. The government of India had allowed 100% FDI in marketing of food products and in food products e-commerce under the automatic route. Automatic मतलब परमिशन लेना नहीं, ऑटोमेटिकली परमिशन आपको मिला है, ऐसा एज्यूम होता है. Considering the diverse needs of the agriculture sector and the larger farming community, a number of interventions are undertaken by different governments. A few recent are as above. Income support to farmers through PM Kisan scheme, fixing of minimum support price MSP at 1.5 times of cost of productions, institutional credit for agriculture sector at concessional rates, launch of the national mission of for edible oils, Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana PMFBY, a novel insurance scheme for financial support to farmers suffering crop loss or damage, mission for integrated development of horticulture MIDI for the holistic growth of horticulture, provision of soil health cards, Paramparagaat Krishi Vikas Yojana PKYG, supporting and promoting organic farming and improvement of soil health, Agriculture Infra Fund AIF, a medium or long-term debt financing facility for investment in viable projects for post-harvest management infrastructure and community farming assets. Promotion of farmer producer organization FPO to ensure better income for the producers through organization of their own. Per drop more crop PDMC scheme to increase water use efficiency at farm level. Setting up of micro irrigation fund. Initiatives towards agriculture mechanism. Setting of ENAM, a pan India electronic trading portal which networks the existing APMC Mandi to create a unified national market for agriculture commodities. Introduction of Kisan Rail for improvement in farm produce logistics. Creation of a startup ecosystem in agriculture and allied sector. Despite phenomenal increase in output of both food crops and commercial crops, Indian agriculture faces many issues such as Indian agriculture is mostly dominated by small and medium farmers, small and fragmented in land holdings, low farm productivity, and subsistence farming, resulting in very little marketable surplus and the consequent lower level of income for the agriculturist. This also reduces their ability to participate in the domestic as well as export market. Indian agriculture is resource intensive, cereal centric, and regionally biased. There is increasing stress on water resources and soil fertility. Unscientific and wasteful agriculture practices lead to desertification and land degradation in many parts of the country. Inadequate agro processing infrastructure and failure to build competitive value chains from producers to urban centers and export markets. Sluggish agriculture diversification to high level commodities. Inadequate adoption of environmentally sustainable and climate resistant new farm technologies. Poor adoption of new agriculture technologies. Loop-sided marketing practices in effective credit mechanism delivery. Complexity associated with adaptation to climate change disturbance. High food level volatility. Heavy dependence on monsoon and loss of crops and livelihoods due to vagaries of nature. Issues related to marketing and warehousing of agriculture products. Inability to tap the full export potential of primary as well as value-added products. Inability to effectively channelize huge surplus in some commodities to alternate profitable destinations. Inadequate post-harvest infrastructure and management practices. And incidence of poverty and malnutrition. Then we have 10.7.2, the secondary sector. The Indian industry holds a significant position in the Indian economy, contributing to 30% of total gross value added in the country and employing over 12.1 crores of people. The industrial sector in India broadly comprises of manufacturing, heavy industries, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, chemicals and petrochemicals, oil and natural gas, food processing, mining, defense products, textile, retail, micro, small and medium enterprise, cotton industries and tourism. The share of informal sector in the economy is more than 50% of GBA. Rapid industrial growth of domestic industries and diversification of industrial structure are essential elements for sustainable economic growth. The development of the robust manufacturing sector is a key priority of the Indian government. A detailed discussion on industrial development is beyond the scope of this unit. Starting with the industrial growth figures, we shall briefly touch upon the general aspects related to industries. In India, the industrial production measures the output of businesses integrated in industrial sector of the economy. Manufacturing is the most important sector and accounts to 78% of the total production. The manufacturing GBA gross value added at current prices was estimated at 77.47 US billion dollars in the third quarter of the financial year 21-22 and has contributed around 16.3% to nominal GBE during the past 10 years. In 22-23 until September 22, the combined index of 8 core industries stood at 142.8, driven by the production of coal, refinery products, fertilizer, steel, electricity and cement industries. In 31st Jan 2023, the manufacturing purchasing manager index PMI in India stood at 55.4. India's rank in the global innovation index GII improved to 40th in 2022 from 81st in 2015. The Department of Promotion of Industry and Internal Debt (DPIIT) has a role in the formulation and implementation of industrial policy and strategies for the industrial development in conformity with the development needs and national objectives. Ever since independence, many innovative schemes are undertaken by different governments from time to time to boost industrial performance. Some of the policy are presented below. Introduction of GST, Goods and Service Tax, on 1st July 2017 as a single domestic indirect tax levied on the entire country, replacing many indirect taxes on India such as excise duty, VAT, service tax, etc. Reduction of corporate tax to domestic companies, giving an option to pay income tax at the rate 22% subject to condition that they will not avail any exemption or incentive. Make in India is a vocal for local initiative launched in 2014 to facilitate investment, foster innovation, build excellent infrastructure and make India a hub for manufacturing, design and innovation. Make in India 2.0 is now focused on 27 sectors, which includes 15 manufacturing sectors and 12 service sectors. Ease of doing business with key focus areas as simplification of procedures, rationalization of legal provisions, digitalization of government process and decriminalization of minor technical or procedural defaults. India ranks 63rd in the World Bank Annual Doing Business Report 2020 as against 77th rank in 2019, registered a jump of 14 ranks. The National Single Window System is a one-stop shop for investment-related approvals and services in the country aimed to provide continuous facilitation and support to investors. PM Gati Shakti National Master Plan to facilitate data-based decisions related to integrated planning of multimodal infrastructures, thereby reducing logistic cost. ये भी important है. National Logistic Mission Policy (NLP) launched in September 2022 aimed to lower the cost of logistics and make it at par with other developed countries. Keeping in view India's vision of becoming Atmanirbhar, the Production Linked Incentives (PLI) scheme was initiated in March 2020 for 14 key sectors to enhance India's manufacturing capabilities and export competitiveness. PLI scheme is now extended for white goods, that is ACs and LED lights. Industrial Corridor Development Program, Greenfield Industrial Regions, areas or nodes with sustainable infrastructure and to make available plug and play infrastructure at the plot level. FAME India scheme, faster adoption and manufacturing of hybrid and electric vehicles to promote manufacturing of electric and hybrid vehicles technology and to ensure sustainable growth for the same. Then we have Udyami Bharat, aims at the empowerment of micro, small and medium enterprise (MSMEs). Then we have PM Mega Integrated Textile Region and Apparel, PM Mitra to ensure world-class industrial infrastructure which would attract cutting-edge technology and boost FDI and local investment in the textile sector. Then opening up for global investments. To make India a more attractive investment destination, the government has implemented several radical and transformative FDI reforms across sectors such as defense, pension, e-commerce, etc. 100% FDI under automatic route is permitted for the sale of coal and coal mining activities, including associated processing, infrastructure, and for insurance intermediaries. Foreign Investment Promotion Board (FIPD) was abolished in May 2017, and a new regime, namely Foreign Investment Facilitation Portal (FIF), has been put in place. Under the new regime, the process for granting FDI approvals has been simplified. 853 FDI proposals were disposed of in the last 5 years. FDI has increased jump by 39% since FIF came into being. The remission of duties and taxes on export products (RoadTap) 2021 formed to replace the existing MEIS merchandise exports for India scheme to boost export. It provides for rebate for all hidden central, state, and local duties, taxes, or levies on the goods exported which have not been refunded under any other existing schemes. India's initiatives towards fostering innovation include incubation, handholding, funding, industry economic partnership, and mentoring and strengthening of IPR schemes. National Logistic Policy (NLP) is a comprehensive policy framework for the logistics sector. Startup India program acts as the facilitator for ideas and innovation in the country. India rank in the Global Innovation Index (GII) has improved from 81st in 2015 to 40 in 2022. Public procurement preferred to Make in India Order 2017 gives preference to local manufacturing goods, works and services in public procurement, thereby giving boost to industrial growth. The Emergency Credit Line Guarantee Scheme (ECLGS) is fully guaranteed emergency credit line to monitor lending institutions. India is gearing up for the fourth industrial revolution or Industry 4.0, which is manufacturing transformation needs to integrate new technologies such as cloud computing, IoT, machine learning, and artificial intelligence (AI). The National Manufacturing Policy, which aims to increase the share of the manufacturing in GDP to 25% by 2025, is a step in this direction. India is an attractive hub for foreign investments in the manufacturing sector. Over the last few years, FDI equity inflow in the manufacturing sector have been progressively rising. India continues to open up its sector to global investors by raising FDI limits and removing regulatory barriers, in addition to developing infrastructure and improving the business environment. According to the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade (DPIIT), India issued a total foreign direct investment (FDI) inflow of US $58.77 billion in 21-22. There are many challenges to the industrial sector. A few of them are enumerated below. First, shortage of efficient infrastructure and manpower, and consequently reduced factory productivity. Second, reliance on imports, exchanges volatility, and associated time and cost overruns. Third, the MSME sector is relatively less favorable placed in terms of credit availability. Fourth, industrial locations established without reference to cost-effective funds tends to experience unsustainable cost structure. Fifth, heavy losses, inefficiencies, lower productivity, and unsustainable returns, lagging public sector industries. Sixth, strained labor management relations and loss of man hours. Seventh, lower exporting competitiveness, flowing external debt, and imposition of non-tariff barriers by other countries. Then, global supply chain disruptions and uncertainties. Then, inflation and associated macroeconomic developments leading to input cost escalation and lower demand. Then, global slowdown and relative negative sentiments affecting investment, aggressive tightening of monetary policies, and increasing cost of credits, high and increasing fuel prices, and mounting of presence of informal sector. Then we have 10.7.3, the tertiary sector. A remarkable feature for the post-reform India economy is the overarching role of for the service sector in generating growth of income and employment. Unlike the usual economic development progress of nations, where economic growth has led to a shift from agriculture to industries or from the primary sector to a secondary sector, India has a unique experience by bypassing the secondary sector in the growth trajectory by a shift from agriculture to service sector. India's service sector covers a wide variety of activities. So here is a small table. The broad classification of service sector as per National Industrial Classification 2008. Wholesale and retail activity of repairs of vehicles, transportation and storage, accommodation and food service activities, information and communication, financial and insurance activities, real estate activities, professional, scientific and technical activities, administrative and support services, public administrative, defense and compulsory security, social security, education, human health and social work activities, arts, entertainment and recreation, other service activities, activities of household as employers, undifferentiated goods and service producing activities of household for own use, activities of extraterritorial organizations and bodies. The service sector referred to the industrial producing intangible goods such as services as output. The service sector is the largest sector of India and accounts for 53.89% of the total India's GVS. The gross value added at current price for the service sector is estimated at rupees 96.54 lakh crores in 2020-21. The service sector is the fastest growing sector in India and has the highest labor productivity. Both domestic and global factors influence their growth for the service sector. The exceptional rapid expansion of knowledge-based services such as professional and technical services has been responsible for the faster growth of the service sector. The production and consumption of information-intensive services activities such as computing, accounting, inventory management, quality control, personal administration, marketing, advertising, and legal services has increased manifold due to application of the state-of-the-art information technology. Service sector growth can also complement growth in the manufacturing sector. The startups which have grown remarkably over the last few years mostly belong to the service sector. India is among the top 10 World Trade Organization's member in service exports and imports. India's service exports at $27 billion recorded robust growth in November 2022 due to software, business and travel services. While exports from all other sectors were adversely affected, India's service exports has remained resilient during the COVID-19 pandemic. The reason are the high demand of digital support and need for digital infrastructure modernization. The Indian service sector is the largest recipient of FDI inflow. FDI equity inflow into the service sector accounted for more than 60% of the total FDI equity into India. The World Investment Report 2022 of UNTACT placed India as the 7th largest recipient of FDI in the top 20 host countries in 2021. In 2021-22, India received the highest ever FDI inflow of $84.8 billion, including 7.1 billion FDI equity inflow in the service sector. To ensure the liberalization of investment in various industries, the government has permitted 100% marks of foreign participation in telecommunication services through automatic route, including all services and infrastructure providers. The FDI ceiling in insurance companies was also raised from 49% to 74%. Measures undertaken by the government, such as the launch of National Single Window System and enhancing in the FDI ceiling through the automatic route, have played a significant role in facilitating investment. Conclusion. The Indian Development Update (IDU) of the World Bank published in November 2022 observes that India has to face an unusual challenging external environment following the Russia-Ukraine war, increased crude oil and commodity prices, persistent global supply disruptions, tightening financial controls and higher domestic inflationary pressures. Despite all these, the real GDP of India grew by 6.3% in July to September of 2022-23, driven by strong private consumption and investment. The report observes that India's economy is relatively more insulated from global spillovers than other emerging markets and is less exposed to international trade flow on account of reliance on its larger domestic market. As such, compared to other emerging economies, India is much more resilient to withstand adversities in the global arena. So that's it in the video. Thank you for watching. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep enjoying. Bye bye.